Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Di Collinson, who's Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the Open University, Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, physician and writer, Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University. We have music from Instant Sunshine, and now there for the umpteenth time, I've named you all Doctor, Novelist, Professor, Lecturer, honourable titles, which put a sort of label on each of you. And I mentioned it because an American lady in the Times the other day, I think it was the Times, was saying the worst bit about no longer being, I think she'd been something like President of the United Steam Muffin Corporation, the worst thing, she said, was no longer being able to sum herself up like that at cocktail parties. Who are you? What are you? Oh, I'm president of Associated Jam Jars. You can't say, I used to be president. And what she missed was the ability so instantly to identify herself, not to mention the social credit rating, the identification conferred. Now, you're all identifiable by the offices you hold. I do not mean that you are only identifiable thereby, but you are, or the métier you follow. Can you sympathise with this lady I've referred to?
The problem is being what you do in that way is that the rating changes its value from time to time. If you say what you do, you are either claiming something or, in fact, you are demoting yourself in some way. And if you turn to somewhere like market research or public relations, they're where people make up their own job titles and call themselves International Associate Director and Creative Director. I mean, they're all creative, which seems to me that other people should decide that. You can't announce that you are a creative director. Then the jobs become meaningless. So it doesn't seem to me to be a very good way of knowing who you are at all.
Well, no, it isn't, but it's a sort of shorthand, and I reveal something, a little something. You once or twice said to me, do you have to say Professor of Sociology? Although I said, yes, you know, anything I can grab to raise the tone of this hot pot supper, I will. And as you know, I dearly love a professor. And, you know, and the way you disclaim it, I would have thought anyone was a professor very pleased to be. I mean, look at you, turn up week after week dressed up in the gown and hood. Well, true, you've got an open collar.
I told you over and over again, as you know very well, that after a number of repetitions, the word professor begins to develop inverted commas and eventually turns into something like Professor Jimmy Edwards. It becomes a title like that.
True enough. Di, what about you?
Well, I must say, I think it makes it all a bit too easy at a party if everybody is presented with their label. I rather like a certain amount of awkwardness in social encounters when you have
Yes.
Otherwise, this awful sort of glibness sets in. The cliches pour forth, corruption, and above all, an insidious melancholy sets in when you get home because you've been labelled and classified in these ways.
Yeah, but did you not sympathise, or evidently not, with the lady I referred to who actually felt the loss of some quick way of saying who she was and what she did?
Well, yes, indeed. And if I am what I eat, why shouldn't I be what I do?
Well, yeah, but I mean, if you were actually ever robbed of that title, Senior Lecturer et de l'Univers, would you feel you'd been deprived, cocktail party-wise?
Well, in a way I would. But I think as a woman, one's been so used to being not thought to be anything at all.
I have no sympathy with her at all, or no empathy with her. I mean, I may be sympathetic.
The better word.
Because I think, as far as I'm concerned, and I know I've caused you a problem, when I was editor of World Medicine, it was very easy.
Simple.
And you and I have had slight difficulty in defining me. I actually know what I do. It's labelling that's difficult. And I took for a time actually to writing in serendipitist as an occupation.
Too waggish.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It sort of had a nice ring to it. And then one year in Tokyo, they'd obviously looked at my passport because when I signed out, the bill had all the things. It had been altered at the top of the bill to physician serendipitist.
Serendipitist. I should have thought you'd have a lot of people showing up asking you to look at their toenails. anything like that. Sarah.
I must just chime in and agree with Di that I do think women suffer from this feeling that they don't do anything. I've known women who go to bizarre lengths to avoid saying they're a housewife, man management and domestic administration and childcare and preschool education, all that kind of thing. But it can be, sometimes I long to have the title of my job, as it were, lifted from me, because it's awful when, in response to somebody's perfectly polite request, I mumble after being pressed, an author or, well, writer, and then I suddenly feel as if I've been bragging on about it for hours, because they latch onto it with a mixture of resentment and curiosity, and then they say, should I have heard of you? And I haven't read any of your works. And then another terrible occasion when things really reached an extremely unlovely pass, when I was visiting one of those countries which are pains to keep their regime away from criticism. And on that little bit of paper they give you on the plane, I put the word writer where it asks you what you do, And when I arrived, I caused this unseemly logjam at immigration, because everybody, writer? There were all sorts of men with, muscly knees showing under their shorts, gathering together and discussing me because I'd said I was a writer. And I had to explain at great length that the sort of thing I wrote wasn't likely to cause even a tremor on the political
You've all
surface.
held office, or you've all got label, or you've got a métier or something. Closest I ever came was when I was Atticus on the Sunday Times, and it was simple. What do you do? They'd say, put it very politely at parties, they'd say, what do you do when you're not knocking table lamps over, leering at other people's wives? And I'd just say, Atticus. And what I liked about it was, it wasn't me, but it was also me. And I rather hope someone might think, his name's Robinson, but he's also Atticus. Someone must have thought he's capable.
But didn't you feel that you needed to turn up in a toga? I mean, that's the trouble with these labels.
I never thought of that.
The great thing the great place for this labelling used to be the old music hall, the billing. I mean, when I used to go as a child, there was always somebody who was billed as a light comedian, and I could never work out what a light comedian was, except that he told a few jokes that weren't very funny, and he sang in a rather inoffensive way.
If you have to say what you do in order to claim a particular identity, the trouble is that you're often imprisoned not only within other people's ranking of the job, because we know that every year, I think there's some sociologist somewhere who works out the relative standing of every job. Now, that's someone else's ranking. It's not based on any knowledge of how that worked. And the other problem is that so many jobs carry with them the title. I mean, when you introduced Di, senior lecturer, me, professor. I mean, that is an account of rank is carried with it. I mean, you don't have, like, senior carpenter.
Well, that's why it's so valuable. I mean, cocktail party terms.
But it is like a claim, and that's why I enjoyed the story of Harold Ross of the New Yorker, who was, when he hired a new employee, he said to him, I'm going to take you on. He said, but don't be too pleased with yourself, and don't think you'll be starting as a reporter. You'll begin as managing editor like everybody else.
What I don't like is when you're introduced to something like a philosopher, you're pinned down like a moth in an exhibition. Also, it sounds rather grand to be described as a philosopher. I never actually recognise myself as a philosopher, and I feel very much pinned down in this way. But, of course, in my heart, I also know that I'm the person who can play Brahms's Academic Festival Overture on an electric mixer, and that is
But you see, but first you get their attention. This is Dr. Di, because you're a real doctor, that's to say a doctor of philosophy, not one of these bachelors of science who pretend to go around and know what's wrong with you. Real doctor, repeat that again, just hope it irritates him, he's working up. And then you can tell them about how you can do the spoons and bones and everything like that. But my friend, he's been mentioned, he's a friend of one or two of us from East Molesey. I don't think I'm breaching a confidence when I tell you that he's something to do with the media. And he gets terribly fed up when people say, what do you do? And he has to tell them, and then they tell him how he should be doing it. And so he's adopted an identity. When they say, what do you do? He just says gas board. Just says gas board. And you see, the conversation can't be picked up after that. I mean, at least not politely, because what can you say? Yes. And they just sort of wrap up and that's it.
I must say, I'm very worried by people who describe themselves as sort of broadcaster, as a broadcaster, because it sounds as if it's something you sort of rush off and do on your own. You sort of leap out of bed in the morning and you say, by Jove, I must go and get a spot of broadcasting done, and I must do it right now. And you sort of shoot off and do it, and you have things to broadcast, and you broadcast, and all engage in this esoteric pursuit.
Bob is particularly pedantic about all this, really. I suspect that's why we're discussing the subject, because I can remember people who arrive here and have difficulty in describing the jobs that they do are people he particularly relishes. I remember somebody who came who worked in public relations, and I think that what they did was to arrange for people to open supermarkets, such things like that. And I can remember you saying to them, as they no sooner got through the door, and you said, what do you do? And this person said, "I organise events," to which you replied, "I thought that was God's work." And I can also recall the way you recoiled practically through the screens. Your chair leapt backwards at least 3 feet when you asked one person, one innocent, 4 or 5 years ago, how would you like to be described? And he simply said, "Wordsmith."
Ah, that's one of the great words. I mean, I'm holding that in reserve for someone who actually deserves it. Di.
I was brooding some philosophy, and I didn't know.
Of course you were.
Yeah, I didn't know if I should mention it, but Jean-Paul Sartre, said
That's a
we
good
should
word.
never, ever accept these labels. It's living in bad faith. His famous example of the waiter, who's a little too deft, a little too assiduous, and so on, who's investing his whole consciousness in the role, and this is all quite wrong.
This business about the identity that Di raised, I mean, I was going to quote another philosopher, Lord Carrington, who gives a marvellous example, I think, of how we should deal with identity, and he illustrated it with when he took over NATO, I think that's what he's doing now, that he went to have lunch with some American general who'd taken a large house somewhere in Hampshire. And he had an extraordinarily attractive wife who was present at the lunch, during the lunch, and they didn't talk about NATO. At the end of the lunch, her sister, and she proved to be an identical twin, came in and took the wife away, and they started talking about NATO, and Carrington said to the general, he said, they really are identical. They're grown up, and how do you tell them apart? To which the general replied, that's their problem.
Of course. Let me turn you a little awry, not askance, at a tangent now. We've been wondering about this. Yes, we have. It's occupied us all week, I can see, absolutely terribly. But I was also wondering, because I can wonder about two things at once, I was wondering about Prince Charles turning up at that pub and saying to them, would you mind if we looked at your telly? And thinking the phrase, would you mind, is one of the most threatening in the language, closely followed by the phrase that does follow it, are you sure? I think "are you sure" is worse, because it means that not content with importuning something that can't be refused, you now want your victim to reassure you. And with Prince Charles, it would all have been very much worse, because you'd be terribly conscious of not having dusted the parlour. Would you mind telling me what your feelings are about would you mind?
I wondered what I would do if it was Prince Charles knocking on my door. I think really the first thing I'd have to do would be ask him for proof of identity, in case he Prince Charles look-alike or something of that sort. I think I'd be entirely nervous and over-polite. I'd probably walk backwards, to be deferential.
I think that would be the correct form.
Not to avert rudely from him, thus damaging myself on the furniture as I did so. Or else I'd shuffle around on my knees in a kind of long drawn-out act of loyal humility. Offer him champagne instead of a cup of tea.
If you happen to have it in.
Rush upstairs, backwards, of course, to disinfect the lavatory quickly.
Yes.
Send out for paper doilies for the biscuit plates.
Well, I agree with you. I would immediately assume some chum of mine had sent round a gorillagram in the shape of prison, and I would instantly send him to the servants' entrance. I mean, that would be it. Oh, dear, what an error.
Yes.
Sarah.
Well, but the point about all these non-refusal requests is that they guide you onto the punch, don't they? Now, there are things like, now there are a lot of these. Is this seat taken? Well, OK, it's not, but you don't know who they're going to put in that seat if you say, no, it's not. Do you like music? I mean, anything from Una Paloma Blanca to Stockhausen. You don't mind animals, do you? That's before sort of six Great Danes in heat charge into the room. Do you like country things? I had a great uncle who used to ask me things like that when I was about 6. Country things? You said yes, and then you were told to go and help with the lambing or something. Are you interested in cars? Would you like to see our slides of the Algarve? But the absolute killer is, are you doing anything on Friday?
Oh.
Now, we all know this one. What the heck do you say? I mean, nothing short of an all-day funeral is going to let you out whatever it is they're going to foist on you.
Reform it altogether. That's the worst one in the
lexicon.
lexicon.
And you do need to have, with those are such terrifying questions, and you do need to have comebacks for those. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, you start to think about comebacks. There was the question asked comparable to the sort of question you're asking, but Edith Sitwell's father, when upon learning that she was leaving home in order to write, actually said to her, "You prefer poetry to human love?" To which she replied, "As a profession, yes." Now, that's the only way to get off that. I mean, that hook is well cast. I mean, I don't know exactly what one would say to Prince Charles. I checked, remember we had a book ages ago by Christopher Ward, which is a book of excuses, and I looked up the very best excuse for keeping people out of your house. I thought the only one we should serve with Prince Charles was, "I shouldn't have opened the door without a mask on. We've got 2 cases of Legionnaire's disease in the house." You need something very big for that occasion.
Yes, very worrying.
I saw a nice little sort of Would You Mind playlet in a London club some time ago. I just sat watching it. The Would You Minder came in and wanted a bit of foreplay and said, instead of Would You Mind, he said, does this television set work? And of course, a crusty character in the corner immediately shouted, no. But he wasn't, because he switched. Oh, look, it does, he said.
How about having...
Would you mind if I watched the racing for a moment? And there's another weasel phrase, for a moment, because it could cover the entire racing at Kempton Park.
You haven't said, could I ask you a small favour? That's really I could...
Yes,
and it's always that word small, because you want to say, what do you mean small? You know.
Laurie, I was just coming to this. My husband was absolutely caught like this in deep snow on our rural station 2 Januaries ago. Tonsillitis, the first train in 3 hours about to come through, and suddenly out of an empty landscape a priest appears. Would you do me a small favour? So he said, are you going to Heathrow? That was showing me with the case and the Brussels. Well, and he said, if so, I wonder if you'd mind accompanying my sister, who's on her way back to Australia. And then, as like a rabbit from a top hat, there appears a nun in full regalia with bare feet and sandals.
You've made this up.
I did not. It is the gospel truth. And my poor husband, what could he say? I mean, there were these 2 religiouses, or religii, whatever you call them, standing in deep snow, and she with the bare feet. What could he say? He had to do the small favour.
There's a medical version of can you do me a small favour, which is, I have this friend.
Well, listen.
There's a medical one as well. Would you mind popping behind the screen and taking off your trousers?
No, listen. May I just... would you mind if I just interrupt? I mean, would you mind if we had a song now? Yeah. I mean, are you absolutely sure? Oh, good, because... I'm going to shove it up your nose if you don't want it. But it's a lovely song from Instant Sunshine, in my opinion.
In my opinion, she was perfect, an angel with green eyes, a face of classic beauty, no makeup could disguise. In my opinion, she was one in several million, as flawless as a coat without a seam. But she wanted a second opinion, and she left me for a surgeon in East Cheam. With affairs of the heart, opinions are often divided. Lovers quarrel and part, and the reasons are often misguided. A strongly held conviction can cause quite unnatural friction that makes one want to scream, be abusive and blaspheme, even run away to Cheam. In my opinion, he was ghastly, a nightmare in a suit, with no redeeming features. He was boorish and a brute. In his opinion, she was nothing but his minion, but she did not fulfill his selfish dream, for she'd reached her second opinion, and she left him to his surgery in East Cheam. With masses of sex, opinions are often divided. An affair often wrecks young lovers whose hearts are collided. If views on love are rigid, they make a new romance so frigid, the outcome's quite extreme. For how can one redeem a love that's lost in Cheam? Current opinions uncertain where to lay the blame, but my opinion's not shifted, my feelings are the same. In my opinion, I would give up a dominion, if I had one, just to see her green eyes gleam. And now our considered opinion is we agree to tie the knot, but not in Cheam.
There we had, in my opinion. Well, a chap said something about me in my role as chairman, of this programme. It was in the paper. Something about me being the apostle of the not very strongly held opinion. And with his permission, that's going on my tombstone. It's a very decent thing to say about a man. Since opinions are the patent medicines of the age, they are the pills people roll the world up into and then peddle them in public and in private as though those pills were the world itself. I have a great deal to say about opinions. Have you ever noticed... Have you ever noticed that there is something morbidly complete about an opinion? You climb inside one and you don't have to go on happening. You've happened. And all you need to do thereafter is continuously repeat yourself, protected from the world by your opinion, as by the most robust of condoms. And if you turn to me, and you claim that what I've just said is itself an opinion, I reply, no, sir. It is a fact, and, sir, if it is not a fact, it is part of a speculative scene of things, a possibility, and I shall have more to say about that later on, when you've all had a chance to agree with me.
I tried to think this afternoon of a single thing in the world about which you did not have an opinion. I mean, I don't have opinions at the moment about Ken Russell's film Gothic, about Kilroy Silk, or the privatisation of the driving test, but I bet you do have about
No, perish the thought, but I knew I was going to come in for contumely and rolled up balls of paper thrown at me, but oh dear, I'll suffer it.
I contend that to have a strong opinion about anything, you must have a firm opinion about yourself. The person who holds a strong opinion about things is somebody who has a very clear opinion of who they are and who they are in relation to other people. And it's also worrying that along with this very clear idea of their own identity, which I think is perhaps a little anxious-making, is also that it's much easier to have a strong opinion about something if you're only in possession of half the facts which have fueled that particular opinion. It goes without... I mean, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it, that if you know all, like we all do...
Where would we be if you didn't? Where would we all be?
Shut up. If we have all the facts about something, if we have the whole spectrum of facts, how can we possibly make up... It would in fact be invidious to have a strong opinion
Wonderful,
about that.
wonderful.
I think this intrigues me, this conversation, because...
I hope so. I mean, that's a mercy.
I suspect I'm in a small minority, but see, the way that... it's the way you get into the opinion business, I think, is important, because if you get into opinions, the word opinion via medicine, it really is a judgment. It's not like Goldwyn saying, don't let your opinions sway your judgment. It doesn't work in medicine. You actually talk in medicine about somebody being a good surgical opinion. I mean, it's a sort of shorthand. And it is a judgment. And the essential thing about medical opinions as judgments is that you can change them.
Bob, you said you thought opinions were like pills.
Yes.
I don't think they're at all like pills, but I do think they're rather like clothes. They're things that have to be aired. In fact, they're almost exactly like clothes. They cover one's mental nakedness. They have to be changed, altered, renewed. It can be passed on or acquired second-hand. And some of our opinions, just like some of our clothes, are extravagant disasters, remembered only with ghastly humiliation. Others, like a favourite dress, are trotted out on all occasions. In fact, the more I think about this, the more similarities I see. I can take any opinion out of my mental wardrobe and ask just the same sort of questions about it as I can ask about clothes. Will it suit the occasion? Is it wearing a bit thin? Is it old-fashioned? Is it provocative? Will it stop them in their tracks? Shall I throw it away? Shall I try something else instead?
There's almost a song in that.
Yes.
I mean, that's nearly right.
And I can wish I hadn't bought it. And by and large, I also think that opinions rank at the same level of seriousness as clothes. They're vital in social discourse, I said that very carefully, and like clothes are both functional and decorative.
That's fine. I agree with that. I think I agree with quite a lot of what you've just said. So long as the person who has the opinion, or the piece of clothing, the article of clothing, doesn't think that he has exchanged the whole of experience for the opinion, that somehow an opinion is but a cartoon or snapshot, and though he feels that it's something he can climb into, so long as he doesn't think that he has exchanged the substance of the world for this, which is merely an abstract of it.
And I'd say a bit more than that, because as clothes, they're very flimsy clothes. I mean, if you want a solid overcoat, then that's an attitude. An attitude is a much more solid piece of clothing. An opinion is a rather flimsy thing, because when you think about it, you can even actually have a national increase in the number of opinions. I mean, since there have been opinion polls and such like things in this country, there seem to be more opinions now than there ever used to be. I was just checking through some old opinion polls and thinking that I don't even know what opinion I held about these matters. I went back to 1965, and there's a question in the Gallup poll, do you think Patrick Gordon Walker is doing a good job as Foreign Secretary? And I thought, well, what did I think? What was my opinion? Or 1969, can you tell me the leader of the Liberal Party? 38% didn't know. Or was I pleased in 1972 that Nixon had been re-elected as President of the USA? 41% said yes. Now, I thought to myself, I must have had an opinion about all those matters, but it's completely gone. But I know that my attitude attitudes like are much more solid and enduring. And the difference about an attitude is it seems to be like a collection of opinions.
That's
If there is a highway which runs from ignorance towards knowledge, then opinion is like the Newport Pagnell of it, whereas Leicester Forest East is the attitude.
Unless the opinion, as it so often happens, becomes an end in itself, then it's a cul-de-sac.
I disagree with you, Laurie. I think that the attitude is the reality, and the opinions exist only when they're solicited, by and large. Opinion poll is a very good example. One of the few pieces of valuable research I did was about 10 years ago when we were doing a public opinion poll on attitudes to medical research. And we had a spare question. So I added in the question, you have just given your opinion on a number of topics to do with medical research. Do you think your opinions, A, generally reflect public opinion on these matters, B, differ from public opinion on these matters, or you don't know? And I was delighted that only 30% thought their views reflected public opinion. 60% thought they were out of step. And I think we all feel we are individuals, and public opinion only exists when the pollster comes round.
Yes, and also don't you think an opinion is by definition spoken or written or otherwise proclaimed? Our real attitudes may be manifested in quite other ways. And I think perhaps an opinion like a dream may often be the absolute opposite of what we instinctively feel. There is some truth in the old romantic novelist convention of the two people who hate each other on sight but who go on to become lovers. I sometimes think that we protest too much in our opinions. We protest against something because it touches us too nearly.
Well, I think an opinion isn't just the expression of a preference or a prejudice. My opinion is what I think, plus all the unseen phalanxes of reasons that are gathering between my ears, ready to spring out and defend what I've said if you take the slightest interest in it.
But don't they depend on other people? I mean, other people's reaction? I have a feeling that a lot of people's opinions exist only in some sort of dynamic with other people, or opinions they attribute to other people. When I was editing a medical journal, I saw myself as a sort of custodian of a forum in which I would invite people to come, and people would invite themselves to come and express an opinion, and others would come in and debate with them. And it was very interesting, the way that contentious issues, like when abortion was a big political issue, was a big medical issue at the end of the 1960s. And what I discovered was that people then attributed to me as editor opinions which I needed to have for them to be able to do something. And I in fact, produced O'Donnell's third law of human perversity. 1 and 2 we'll say for another programme. And that
Don't waste it. Don't waste
the third law is that if an editor publishes two strongly held opinions on a contentious issue, each side will decide that the editor's personal views coincide with those of the opposition. I think any editor will tell you that you are biased against their point of view, and I think their point of view exists largely in terms of your bias.
And that links to the feeling that often that you've got to take a different opinion simply because, as I think somebody once said, you find that the best seats have already been taken. That, in other words, that that people have got in first and said that this is a splendid film, and somehow you've got to maintain and manage for it not to be a splendid film. And then that's something to do really with almost opinions as not being of much value, because you could think this or you could think that. And I wonder how much emotion there is in it, because when people say, well, in my opinion, if you question the opinion, then the personality, the person pops through after about 3 exchanges.
Yes.
After about 3 or 4 exchanges, you suddenly think, it's not his opinion, it's Bob, it's Michael, it's Sarah, it's that's what, it's something to do with them. And you suddenly think,
but the alas and the alack of what you're saying is that a lot of people, whether they're named Michael or Bob or whatever, walk round not seeing the world but in a kind of private cinema. They have actually transferred the essence of their own being, which is what you're saying, into the opinions. And they don't, once they disappear into their opinions, you look at Norman Tebbit, if you can, at Dennis Healy, if you also can. There you see two people who have been manufactured entirely out of opinions, and there is no chink through which you can see the actual human being, because they have transferred their substance
Di, you see, we were talking about Sartre in another context before, but I can remember when he was talking about the fact that he said immediately, I think it was immediately after the war, he said there's a great danger in thinking people who say, well, in my opinion, the Jews really are a rather inferior sort of group of people. There's a great danger in assuming that this opinion was simply one among opinions, and that you had to look at the cluster of opinions which formed, as he said, an anti-Semitic personality. Indeed, other people went on to develop an authoritarian personality. The idea that these little tiny, these bits of clothes that, that Di was describing, that when you put together the handkerchief and the suit and the boots and the clothes and the scarf, together they do make up something that's sinister. And when you say, for example, that you don't have opinions, I'm reminded of Michael Frayn delightfully saying once, to be absolutely honest, what I feel really bad about is that I don't feel worse. There's the ineffectual liberals' problem in a nutshell.
No, but you see, the trouble with these opinions that you say have to be put together to be analysed and see how all this thing started. The trouble with that sort of opinion, the sort you were discussing, the serious matter, is that all those opinions actually spare you responsibility because you are joining with others. And insofar as you join with others, you lose a little bit of yourself, and you should be very, very careful.
Yes, I think you lock horns with others, don't you? It's a sort of a painless kind of conflict you enter into. We stick our heads above the parapet with our opinions, so we join in. That's why people think people are cowardly for not having an opinion. And so this is why people very often precede an absolute barrage of unsubstantiated views and comments with phrases like, if I could just put in my 4 pence. My opinion for what it's worth, they say, and then they go roaring down the track, demolishing everybody.
I think that an opinion is really my opinion. It isn't this joining in with everybody else. If I've really managed
joining
to
in with the people who agree with you is what I meant.
But you don't know about the people who agree with you. Another thing about opinions is that you don't really know what your opinion is until you've uttered it on some sort of obscure analogy with the law that if you want to find out what use some space monopolising piece of rubbish has, throw it away today, for then tomorrow one's need for it and it alone will make itself unrelentingly felt. The best way to test a tentatively held opinion is to air it as assertively as you can and then watch it wither under critical scrutiny.
I must say, have you ever met anyone as scientific, as, objective, as unsubjective as all that? If you say yes, you're a fibber, Di.
I've never seen an opinion wither. Maybe I'm going to the wrong bars.
I'm impressed by Bob's thesis that the opinion materially taking over part of the sort of cellular structure of the individual, because it's very interesting to me. It becomes it changes from an opinion to a faith then, really. And it interests me when people approach me in one of my identities as a doctor, that they ask me in terms of faith for an opinion. And as a doctor, I regard opinions as judgment. They don't say, have you studied the evidence about acupuncture? They say, do you believe in acupuncture? Do you believe in copper bracelets as a treatment for rheumatism? As though I've got to change my judgment opinion into some sort of faith that matches their own.
Sorry, go on.
I was just offering you support for what you were saying earlier
and I may
on.
say it was entirely welcome, and I agree with everything you say.
You didn't give the impression it wasn't my opinion.
Laurie was saying earlier that the attitude is different from the opinion, and I had said even earlier that what I was interested in was a possible scene of things, a sort of tissue of speculation. Now, I've often said here that I prefer fiction to almost anything else, and I like to think this programme has strong elements of the fictional.
Absolutely.
You see, because what we don't do, and I don't believe we can be accused of having done it now, is we aren't putting on little bits of pasteboard, our opinions, and handing them around. That would be just like exchanging conventional signs. What we're doing altogether is weaving a little tissue of speculation. What we're saying all the time is, I wonder if, just suppose that, what if, and when we come on to all those anecdotes we sometimes tell, and I say to you, Michael, you mean your grandfather couldn't tell the difference between ham and salmon and things like that. What we're really doing, we're operating a speculative scene of things, which I think is even more sophisticated than Laurie's attitude coming from the opinion. We try on opinions for size, little arm wrestling, that kind of thing, but we aren't opinion mongering. And at the end of this small sermon, I would just like to say this, that opinions are to thought what ready-made jokes are to humour. A substitute.
Dr. Diane Collinson, Sarah Harrison, Dr. Michael O'Donnell and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.